something has shifted in the Pacific, and star casual, fancher, dying power, and not in the way Beijing expected. On April 17th, 2025, a Japanese maritime self-defense force destroyer quietly departed from its home waters, pointed its bow southward, and did something that no Japanese warship had done in living memory within the modern strategic context of Eastasia. It entered the Taiwan Strait, not in a coordinated allied formation, not under the formal umbrella of a multinational freedom of navigation exercise, alone, deliberately, in the early hours of the morning when visibility was low and the timing could not be mistaken for anything accidental. The JS Ikazuchi, an Akazuki-class destroyer, moved through those contested waters for approximately 14 hours, working on, and in doing so, altered the terms of every strategic conversation happening across the Asia-Pacific region. This was not a provocation in the theatrical sense. There was no declaration, no press conference. Ahead of a transit. The move was made with the quiet, disciplined confidence of a government that had spent years preparing for the moment when words would no longer be sufficient and had finally decided that the moment had arrived. The message, for those paying attention, was unmistakable. Japan was no longer going to wait at its borders and issue concerned statements while China reshaped the rules of engagement in the waters surrounding it. Tokyo had decided to act within those contested spaces itself on its own terms, under its own flag. The reaction from Beijing came swiftly and was, by any honest measure, revealing. The People's Liberation Army Navy placed both naval and air assets on heightened alert. Radar systems locked onto the Ikazuchi throughout its passage. Chinese military communications reportedly echoed with warnings and demands, and yet for all the surveillance, all the radio traffic, all the visible tension, Beijing did not physically intervene. Not a single vessel moved to block the Japanese ship's course. Not one warning shot was fired. When the Ikazuchi completed its transit and emerged from the southern end of the strait, China's operational response amounted to a stern press conference. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian appeared before cameras and condemned the transit in strong diplomatic language, calling it a deliberate provocation and a destabilizing act that damaged bilateral relations. But on the water, in those 14 hours that actually mattered, China blinked. That is the detail that reframes everything else, because the Taiwan Strait is not simply a body of water. In Beijing's strategic doctrine, it is treated as something close to sovereign territory. Narmi sao user sar corridor over which China claims control, management rights, and the authority to define the terms of passage. For years, Beijing has used that framing to pressure other nations, to warn off naval vessels, and to assert that transiting the strait without China's implicit approval constitutes a hostile act. Multiple Western navies have conducted freedom of navigation transits in the strait, and each time Beijing has protested loudly, but a Japanese warship is categorically different. Japan is not a distant Western power operating far from home. Japan is China's immediate geographic neighbor. Japan sits directly astride every maritime exit route that China's Navy must use to reach the open Pacific. And Japan, for decades, chose to conduct its security policy within a framework of restraint that gave Beijing enormous strategic room. That restraint is now, by observable evidence, coming to an end. To understand why this transit carries the strategic weight it does, you have to go back further than April 17th. You have to look at the accumulated pressure that preceded it, and at the geography that makes every decision in this region a decision with cascading consequences. The concept of the first island chain has been central to Chinese military planning for decades. It refers to the arc of islands stretching from the Japanese archipelago southward through the Ryukyu Islands, past Taiwan, and continuing toward the Philippines. Within Chinese strategic thinking, this chain represents a geographic barrier archian that constrains the PLA Navy's ability to project power into the deeper Pacific. As long as the nations holding these islands maintain operational control and military presence, China's fleet is effectively boxed into the shallow littoral seas of East Asia. The Western Pacific, with its deep water and open routes toward Hawaii, Guam, and beyond, remains functionally out of reach for sustained Chinese naval power. And breaking through the first island chain, or at minimum neutralizing the ability of the nations on that chain to deny passage, has been one of China's most consistent and deeply held strategic goals. Japan sits at the northern anchor of this chain, and within Japan's territory, 2 points are particularly critical. The first is the Senkaku Islands, a small uninhabited cluster of islets in the East China Sea that both Japan and China claim, and around which Beijing has conducted increasingly aggressive operations for years. The second is the Miyako Strait, a narrow passage just south of Okinawa that represents one of the few viable deep-water routes through which Chinese naval vessels can transit from the East China Sea into the Philippine Sea without passing through Japanese territorial waters. These 2 points are not just political flashpoints, they are physical choke points with direct military significance. China cannot comfortably access the Pacific without passing through or near them. Japan knows this, Beijing knows that Japan knows this, and the behavior of both governments over the past several years can only be understood within that geographic reality. What has changed in 2025 and 2026 is that Japan has begun to demonstrate through concrete operational action rather than policy statements that it intends to actively use its geographic position as a strategic instrument, not merely to defend its own territory, but to shape the behavior of adversaries in the wider regional environment. This is a meaningful shift, and its roots go back several years. Japan's post-war constitutional framework placed severe restrictions on the use of military force. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, as interpreted through decades of legal precedent and political convention, limited the self-defense forces to a purely defensive posture. Japan could protect itself if attacked. It could not, under the traditional interpretation, project military force abroad or use its capabilities to intervene in conflicts that did not directly involve Japanese territory. For decades, this framework was not merely a legal constraint, it was it was a genuine reflection of political consensus within Japan. The memory of World War II and of what Japanese militarism had meant for the region made the pacifist framework broadly legitimate both domestically and internationally. And that consensus cannot in a case been not eroding for years under the cumulative pressure of a more assertive China, a rearmed and increasingly aggressive Russia, and the growing recognition within Japan's strategic community that passive defense in a deteriorating regional security environment is not a sustainable position. The reinterpretation of collective self-defense in 2015 under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was an early signal. The dramatic increase in Japan's defense budget officially targeting 2% of GDP, a level not seen since the post-war period. Was a more concrete one. The decision to acquire counter-strike capabilities, including long-range cruise missiles capable of striking targets beyond Japanese territory, was perhaps the clearest indication that Japan's strategic doctrine was undergoing a fundamental transformation. But doctrine is one thing, operational behavior is another. The transit of the Ikazuchi through the Taiwan Strait is the most visible single action in a pattern of operational behavior that has been building for months. In March 2026, just weeks before the Ikazuchi's transit, China conducted what analysts described as a large-scale maritime access restriction exercise in the waters around Taiwan. Reports indicated that China imposed airspace restrictions with code suggesting unlimited altitude restrictions from the surface upward and position naval forces in a pattern consistent with a blockade rehearsal. The intent, based on observable positioning and official Chinese commentary, appeared to be a demonstration that Beijing had the capacity to isolate Taiwan from external support and resupply in a crisis scenario. It was a message directed simultaneously at Taiwan, at the United States, and at the broader regional audience watching from Tokyo, Seoul, Manila, and Canberra. The Ikazuchi's transit came 48 hours after Russian combat corvettes concluded a port visit to China. seems unlikely to be coincidental in the timing calculus of Japan's defense planners. When Russia and China coordinate their naval presence in the waters surrounding Japan, the strategic logic from Tokyo's perspective is not subtle. Japan faces potential simultaneous pressure from the north, where Russia's Pacific Fleet maintains a nuclear submarine force and frequently transits the narrow straits around Hokkaido, Pazir, Aldir, Saumir, Kalmindao, Damir Kagan from the south and west, where China's expanding navy has been probing the gaps in Japan's defensive posture. Operating under that dual pressure with no guarantee that a crisis in one direction would not be deliberately timed to coincide with pressure from the other, Japan's strategic planners have concluded that deterrence requires more than defensive positioning. It requires visible operational presence in the spaces that matter. The months immediately preceding the Ikazuchi's transit provided Tokyo with ample material evidence of that strategic logic. In January 2026, according to reports and observed maritime tracking data, Chinese maritime militia vessels, civilian-flagged fishing boats used as instruments of state maritime pressure, formed what observers described as a floating barrier formation near contested waters in the East China Sea. This gray zone tactic, which Beijing has refined and deployed extensively in the South China Sea against the Philippines, exploits the gap between civilian and military activity. The vessels are not warships, so engaging them militarily creates escalation risk and political complications, but their presence is not civilian in any meaningful operational sense. They carry communication equipment, they coordinate with PLA Navy assets, and their positioning is clearly directed by state actors pursuing strategic objectives. Responding to maritime militias with proportionate force is legally and politically complicated. Not responding allows the tactic to succeed. Japan chose to respond. Japanese Coast Guard vessels and military patrol aircraft were dispatched to the area. The response was not passive. Patrol aircraft flew directly over the Chinese vessels. Water cannon-equipped Coast Guard ships shadowed them at close range. The Chinese fleet, according to observers, following the situation, withdrew. Tokyo did not issue triumphant statements. It simply demonstrated through operational action that the gray zone approach would not produce the desired result in Japanese waters. Then came the Senkaku incident of March 2026. 4 heavily armed Chinese Coast Guard vessels entered Japanese territorial waters near Minamiko-jima Island, one of the smaller islets in the Senkaku cluster, and patrolled within 12 miles of its coastline for 3 consecutive days. The duration was not accidental. 3 days is long enough to be a sustained statement, short enough to avoid the kind of escalation that would trigger a formal military response. Under previous Japanese governments, the response to such incursions typically involved radio warnings, diplomatic protests, and careful public messaging designed to avoid inflaming the situation. The response in March 2026 was different in character. Japanese Coast Guard assets deployed to the area in strength. Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force patrol aircraft flew directly over the Chinese vessels. The Chinese Coast Guard ships were tracked continuously, their every movement observed and recorded. Japan did not just file a protest. It physically contested the Chinese vessel's presence with a visible, sustained operational response. The cumulative message of these incidents, the maritime militia confrontation, the Senkaku incursion and response, and now the Ikazuchi transit, is that Japan has made a deliberate decision to match China's operational escalation with its own operational response, rather than relying exclusively on diplomatic channels that have historically produced little behavioral change from Beijing. This matters because diplomatic protests are essentially cost-free for Beijing. Firing off a strongly worded condemnation in response to a Japanese diplomatic note involves no operational cost and no strategic concession. Watching a Japanese destroyer complete a 14-hour transit through the Taiwan Strait while your own naval assets can only observe and issue radio warnings is an entirely different experience. It demonstrates capability, it demonstrates will, and it demonstrates that the geographic and operational assumptions Beijing has been working with are no longer reliable. China's formal response, condemning the transit, calling it a deliberate provocation, was exactly what anyone familiar with Beijing's standard playbook would have predicted. What Beijing did not do is equally significant. There was no pursuit, no physical interception, no escalatory military action that would have tested whether Tokyo's operational confidence translated into operational resolve under pressure. That restraint tells its own story. China is acutely aware that a physical confrontation with a Japanese warship in the Taiwan Strait would immediately activate the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, drawing the United States directly into a military confrontation at a time and place of Japan's choosing rather than China's. The risk calculation does not favor escalation, and so Beijing absorbed the operational embarrassment and settled for strongly worded diplomatic language that, outside of Chinese state media, convinced very few people of China's actual strategic confidence. The Russia dimension of this story deserves careful attention because it is frequently underestimated in Western analytical coverage focused primarily on the China-Taiwan-US triangle. Russia's Pacific Fleet, operating from Vladivostok, has for years conducted exercises and transits designed to signal to Tokyo that Japan's security concerns extend in multiple directions simultaneously. Russian naval vessels have circumnavigated Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost major island, passing through the Tsugaru and Soya Straits in what are understood to be deliberate proximity demonstrations. The Kuril Islands, seized by the Soviet Union in the final days of World War II and never returned to Japan, provide Russia with a strategic foothold that extends its military presence to Japan's immediate north. Russia's relationship with Japan has deteriorated sharply since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Tokyo imposed significant sanctions on Moscow and has provided humanitarian and material support to Ukraine, making it one of the most consequential non-European contributors to the Western response. In return, Moscow has made no effort to moderate its Pacific posture and has, if anything, intensified its demonstrations of naval capability in Japan's near vicinity. The joint Russia-China naval exercises that have been conducted in recent years, exercises that involve circumnavigating Japan and operating in the waters of the Japan Sea, the East China Sea, and the Western Pacific simultaneously, represent a coordinated effort to make Tokyo feel strategically encircled. Two nuclear-armed powers, one to the north and one to the west, conducting coordinated military operations in the waters surrounding an island nation that cannot escape its geography. Japan's response to that strategic encirclement has been to invest heavily in the military capabilities that would allow it to operate effectively within the encirclement rather than simply defending against penetration of its own borders. The transformation of the helicopter carriers JS Izumo and JS Kaga into what are functionally light aircraft carriers, modified with heat-resistant flight decks and equipped to carry F-35B short takeoff and vertical landing stealth fighters, represents a generational leap in Japan's power projection capability. An F-35B operating from the JS Izumo is not a defensive asset in the traditional sense. It is an offensive platform capable of striking targets at significant range, operating with low radar visibility, and projecting Japanese air power far beyond the home islands. 12 to 15 such aircraft operating from a single ship transforms every ocean area within that ship's operating range into a contested airspace. Japan's surface fleet, meanwhile, has grown into one of the most capable in the world by any objective measure. The Maritime Self-Defense Force currently operates more than 48 modern destroyers, with the Akazuki and Maya classes representing the cutting edge of Japanese naval engineering. Many of these vessels are equipped with the Aegis combat system, the same advanced radar and fire control architecture that forms the backbone of American naval air defense, giving Japan the ability to track and simultaneously engage large numbers of aerial targets across a wide geographic area. The integration of extended-range surface-to-ship missiles, including the Type 12 in its upgraded form with a range exceeding 1,000 kilometers, and the acquisition of the Tomahawk cruise missile from the United States, means that Japan's destroyers are no longer simply defensive platforms. They can reach out and strike targets at distances that fundamentally change the strategic geometry of any confrontation in the Western Pacific. Below the surface, Japan's submarine fleet is arguably its most strategically valuable asset and its most underappreciated one. The Soryu and Taige classes, comprising roughly 22 boats in total, are diesel-electric submarines incorporating advanced lithium-ion battery technology that allows them to operate silently and independently for extended periods without surfacing or snorkeling. These boats are exceptionally quiet by any international standard of comparison. They operate throughout the choke points of the first island chain in the waters of the Miyako Strait near the Bashi Channel in the approaches to the Philippine Sea, and their presence there is a constant, invisible reminder to Chinese naval planners that any attempt to transit those waters in force would take place under the observation and potential interdiction of an adversary whose exact location is unknown. The value of a submarine as a strategic deterrent is not the number of ships it has sunk. It is not just the uncertainty it forces upon an adversary's planning at every moment. All of these capabilities, the converted carriers, the Aegis destroyers, the silent submarine fleet, the extended range missiles, physical expression of a strategic decision Japan made years ago and has been building toward incrementally. The Ikazuchi's transit through the Taiwan Strait is the most visible public demonstration of a military and strategic posture that has been hardening quietly for a long time. It is not a sudden emotional response to China's behavior. It is a calculated operational statement from a government that has concluded that visible, concrete demonstrations of capability and will are more effective deterrents than diplomatic complaints to an adversary that has consistently ignored diplomatic complaints. The broader implications of this shift extend well beyond the bilateral Japan-China relationship. For Taiwan, the message from Tokyo's action carries real weight. Japan's willingness to assert operational presence in the Strait is a signal that Tokyo is invested in the outcome of any crisis there in ways that go beyond formal alliance commitments. For the United States, which has long encouraged Japan to take a more active role in regional security while simultaneously managing the political complications that increased Japanese assertiveness creates, the Ikazuchi's transit is both an asset and a complexity. Washington wants Chitoker Chokiyur Yir Kao Dan to thou contribute more to regional deterrence. Washington must also manage the risk that Tokyo's increasingly independent operational posture creates escalation scenarios that do not follow the carefully managed escalation ladders that American strategic planning prefers. For the smaller nations of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, watching from the sidelines as China, Japan, Russia, and the United States maneuver through the surrounding them, the Japanese transit sends a message that the regional balance of power is shifting in ways that are not entirely within Beijing's control. China's approach to the South China Sea has rested partly on the assumption that its neighbors lack the strategic depth and military capacity to resist Chinese pressure on their own. Japan demonstrating willingness to project operational presence into the Taiwan Strait complicates that assumption. It suggests that the first island chain is not a passive geographic feature, but an active strategic instrument wielded by a Japan that is now choosing to wield it assertively. The question that strategic analysts are now focused on is not whether this happened, it demonstrably did. The question is whether it represents a durable change in Japan's operational posture or a carefully staged one-time statement designed to send a signal without committing to a sustained pattern of behavior. The evidence, on balance, suggests the former. The investments Japan has made in military capability over the past several years are not temporary. The constitutional reinterpretations and legal frameworks that now permit Japan's self-defense forces to operate in ways previously prohibited are not reversible through normal political cycles. The domestic political consensus that once constrained Japanese strategic ambition has shifted, and that shift reflects genuine public concern about the security environment Japan faces, not a manufactured crisis or a temporary political moment. What Beijing strategists are now grappling with is HR Hander has effectively called their bluff at one of the most symbolically charged locations possible. The Taiwan Strait was supposed to be China's domain, a waterway where Beijing set the terms and other nations were expected to accept or at minimum tolerate China's implicit authority. Japan did not accept it. And it did so without firing a shot, without provoking a direct confrontation, and without giving China a clean justification for the kind of escalatory response that would immediately internationalize the crisis. The operational elegance of the move is inseparable from its strategic impact. For China, the fundamental problem is that the geography has not changed. Japan still sits astride the exits from the East China Sea into the Pacific. The Miyako Strait is still narrow. The Bashi Channel core is the Zashi is still watched. China's naval expansion has been extraordinary in scale, but scale alone does not resolve the geographic constraint imposed by the first island chain. And now Japan has signaled publicly that it intends to maintain and actively use that geographic advantage, not just to defend its own territory, but to shape the operational environment across a broader arc of waters. What comes next is genuinely uncertain and stating that clearly is more honest than projecting confidence. China is unlikely to simply absorb this development and move on. The domestic political pressures on Beijing's leadership to respond assertively to perceived humiliations are real and cannot be wished away. Whether that response takes the form of intensified operations around the Senkaku Islands, additional exercises near Taiwan, increased maritime militia activity in the East China Sea, or some combination of all of these is the question that defense planners in Tokyo, Washington, and Taipei are almost certainly working through in detail right now. The signals to watch are the positioning of Chinese naval and Coast Guard assets in the East China Sea in the days and weeks following the transit, the tone and content of PLA strategic communications, and whether China attempts any form of reciprocal demonstration in waters it considers adjacent to Japanese territory. Russia's behavior in the Northern Pacific is also a variable that will bear watching. Moscow has consistently sought to time its Pacific Fleet activities to create maximum strategic noise for Tokyo, and a period when Japan is absorbing criticism from China following a high-profile transit would be a predictable moment for Russia to conduct some form of visible naval demonstration near Hokkaido. Whether that happens and how Tokyo responds if it does will tell us something important about whether Japan's new strategic posture is as durable under simultaneous pressure as it appears when facing one adversary at a time. What has definitively changed, regardless of how subsequent events unfold, is the strategic baseline. Japan has demonstrated that it will operate in the Taiwan Strait under its own sovereign judgment. China has demonstrated that its response to that operation will be verbal rather than physical, at least in the current operational context. The gap between Beijing's stated claims about the strait and its actual ability to enforce those claims through operational action has been made visible, not just to strategic analysts and allied governments, but to the entire audience of nations watching the Pacific balance of power evolve in real time. The old Japan and the one that retreated to diplomatic language whenever the situation became operationally uncomfortable, that treated its constitutional constraints as permanent features of the strategic landscape, that assumed its geographic position could be managed passively, as were Gurkur, Nansha, is functionally gone. What replaced it is a Japan that has concluded, after years of careful deliberation and massive investment, that the only credible deterrent in the current environment is one that demonstrates both capability and will in the spaces where the competition is actually occurring. The Taiwan Strait on April 17th was that space. The JS Ikazuchi was that demonstration. The waves it sent through the strategic calculations of every government watching are still moving outward, and the responses those waves produce from Beijing, from Moscow, from Washington, from the smaller nations threading their way through an increasingly contested Asia, for Pacific, define the next chapter of a competition that is growing more intense, more constrained, and more consequential with every passing month. The water will not be calm again. The question is only how the next storm moves. No man stams our faumster, no oneer da sao, and yao kur stamstao, worstao says, pauses those positioned to ride it. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.